After months of pushing for a rapid return to normal, President Trump's in the hospital and a growing number of his political allies have also tested positive for COVID-19. With cases rising in many countries, will Trump's illness become a wake-up call for Americans and others around the world? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobbie. Now, the news that the US President Donald Trump and his wife Melania have tested positive for coronavirus has shaken Washington. Trump is the third world leader to contract the virus. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro also succumbed. Now, the experience of all three men is a reminder that the virus does threaten everyone. Rob Reynolds sets up our conversation.
With the president hospitalized and facing a period of treatment and quarantine, all Trump campaign events are now on hold. It's unclear if the next presidential debate, scheduled for October 15th, will go ahead. Trump's last rally before the diagnosis was in Minnesota on Wednesday. As usual, he did not wear a mask, and neither did many of his supporters. Trump had planned rallies in Florida, Wisconsin, and Arizona over the next several days. Trump campaign officials say the president's absence from the campaign trail is not particularly important.
I don't think it's going to change a lot of minds one way or the other. The people that love him, the people that hate him. There's a little bit of independent in between that seem to be breaking his way, and that's going to be the difference in the ballgame.
Trump's infection also undercuts one of his central themes in these final days before the election, which is that the pandemic is waning, even though more than 207,000 Americans have died from it.
The end of the pandemic is in sight, and next year will be one of the greatest years in the history of our country.
Some voters may wonder if, since the president could not keep himself or his wife safe from the pandemic, he can keep the country safe from it.
It's definitely ironic to have them have COVID, especially when earlier this week he was making fun of Joe Biden for wearing a mask, and last week he said that COVID virtually impacts no one.
So we don't wish any ill will to the president, but it's not at all a surprise given the direction. We just hope that this will cause a change in the direction of his leadership and that he will curtail some of the activities like really the campaign rallies where he's essentially being the piper of COVID and spreading this around.
After testing negative for COVID-19, Democratic nominee Joe Biden continued his campaign and flew to Michigan. He expressed concern for Trump and the First Lady.
This is not a matter of politics. It's a bracing reminder to all of us that we have to take this virus seriously.
Biden's events are generally small and strictly adhere to virus control recommendations, including mask wearing and distancing. In Tuesday's debate, Trump mocked Biden for wearing masks and questioned his intelligence.
Because you know what? There's nothing smart about you.
Now, Biden's caution seems to be the smarter approach. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera.
Well, President Trump is just one of hundreds of thousands of Americans who's been infected with COVID-19, coronavirus. It is the worst affected country in the world with the highest number of COVID-19 infections and deaths. It's followed by India with more than 100,000 fatalities. With more than 34 million infections worldwide, the pandemic has disrupted life, strained healthcare systems, and disrupted economies globally. OK, there we are. Here we go. Let's bring in our panel today here on Inside Story. In London, we have Heidi Larson, Director of the Vaccine Confidence Project at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. In India's capital, we've got Rajib Dasgupta, social epidemiologist and professor at the School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. And in Washington, D.C., we have Rina Shah, a public health specialist and Republican strategist who is supporting Joe Biden's campaign. She's the founder of GOP Women for Biden. Welcome to you all. Rina, can I come to you first? You're there in D.C. This is Trump has COVID hashtag ground zero on this amazing development when he tweeted, yes, I've got it, he's now in hospital. Is it, however, a manifestation of an almost completely disconnected implementation of public policy and the reality of public policy?
Well, undoubtedly, the president coming down with COVID, supposedly, is truly the most somber reminder, my fellow citizens, I could have of how this virus continues to plague our country, and that there has been no plan. Look, we had our first presidential debate this past week between Trump and Biden, and we didn't learn of his plan then either. So what I really believe is at play right now is a great deal of uncertainty in the minds of Americans everywhere about just when this will be contained on our shores. Public policy, we know, in its many forms in the United States, is often knee-jerk. It's made as a result of somebody experiencing some really particularly negative consequence. And so what I believe conventional wisdom would lead us to believe is that this president would come out of this, hopefully, and certainly all of us wish him a speedy recovery, but he would come out of this different. My sense, though, having witnessed Donald Trump these past 4 years, is that he may come out of this saying, I wore a mask, my mask was not effective enough, and I still got COVID, and I've lived to tell the tale, and it wasn't that bad. That is my prediction.
Heidi Larson, let's globalize this where you are. Boris Johnson contracted coronavirus. He was hospitalized. He was in ICU. He took several weeks to look and sound as if he was firing on all cylinders again. But if you look at the US administration, if you look at Bolsonaro in South America, Boris Johnson where you are, it's like an advent calendar of powerful politicians, you know, oh, he's got it, oh, she's got it, that person's got it. And then we have this ripple effect of testing. Why is it these politicians, it boils down to don't do as I do as I say?
Yes, to a certain extent, and some of it's a bit of bad luck, but certainly taking more proactive measures. I mean, you see on the other extreme, Putin, who's quite extremely isolated and taking kind of an extreme measure for distancing. But on the other hand, I think there are, I mean, the actual conflicting messages has been one of the issues that has plagued the response, is people feel like they're getting contradictory messages. But to just point out that Boris Johnson also started with milder symptoms, was working from home. I'm doing great, guys. I'm in there. And every day you saw him sliding down in his chair and looking. The stage of that we're at with President Trump is early. We really won't know the trajectory of this for at least a week, I would say maybe even 10 days.
That's a valid point, I'm sure. Rajib, coming to you in New Delhi. There's nothing like this where you are. And when I say that, what I mean is, you know, nobody in the highest location politically has contracted coronavirus. As far as we know, they could have, and they've been asymptomatic all the time. But it seems to me that in India, the implementation of laid down policy is impossible for people to carry through on, because you've got localized spikes where the infection rate is climbing quite quickly. But the reality is that so many people in India have to move around, particularly at these challenging times, to get jobs. And the reality is they are going from areas where there's a high incidence of COVID-19 to low areas, i.e. they might be taking it with them, or they're doing it the other way around. They're going into areas with high levels of COVID-19.
Well, a correction to the first part of your statement. Certainly high-ranking politicians have contracted COVID. The very high-profile Home Minister, he did have COVID. He was hospitalized on 3 episodes, particularly for post-COVID syndrome. In fact, post-COVID syndrome actually became a talking point after his last admission. Several ministers in different states have contracted COVID. There have been a few mortalities. In the last week, the Minister of State for Railways in the government of India, he was 60 plus. He unfortunately passed on account of COVID, the first union minister to have succumbed to the COVID. And most importantly, we had a brief session of the parliament last week, a truncated session of about 5 days or so, in which all staff members of the Parliament House, as well as the the members of Parliament, were mandatorily tested. And it started on 7th September, at which time there were 25 positives among the 1,500 staff members. And by the time the session ended, there were 83 staff members who tested positive. And the Vice President of India, he was detected to be positive, but he certainly remains asymptomatic. So politicians and ministers, and certainly those in the highest levels of government, have been affected by COVID. And to come to the issue of the common man, yes, as you outlined, as economic activities open up, we are in phase 5 of unlock. This is really going to be the challenging phase, particularly tempered with the fact that in September, 40% of the global cases have been reported from India, and 30% plus deaths. So September has really been the most challenging, and we'll have to wait and see how October goes.
Rina, coming back to you in Washington, it's early days for the Trump administration. If we talk about the optics of Mr. Trump's health issues right now, and also Melania, and also Hope Hicks, at what point does this administration start explicitly telling people you cannot break the ordinances on your health? Wear a mask, get tested regularly if you can, if you want to, behave with respect for yourself and everyone else?
Well, let me take a step back to many months ago. Back in April, this administration pushed out a social media campaign, and it was a public health campaign, let's be honest. I'm sure it made its way onto TV airwaves as well, that said 15 days to slow the spread. In fact, they started it with stop, and then they also used slow. So from the get-go, the Trump administration, as a federal unified response, really genuinely failed in doing so, because what the president was doing from the back end was saying to the governors of all of our states is do what you want to do. Keep your borders open, close them, do whatever you want to do. Now, I've got to be honest with you. This is one of those moments as a limited government proponent, as somebody who believes in limited government, having made my career in Republican politics, I am not one for a federal unified response at all times. But when we started to see the facts, when we started to see the spread through the country, after it originated in Washington state, out west here in the United States, that is when I believe our federal government had a responsibility to put down a mandate. But that's really difficult because Republicans hate mandates. And so let me say this. I really believe this president, given he's been all over the map in his response. He said things such as, if we didn't test so much, we wouldn't have so many cases. Illogical things like that. Even last week, he said dangerous things, such as I believe other countries like India. He pointed out India, which has been a great ally to the United States. He said, I believe they're fudging their numbers. So he's been all over the place. It's really hard to believe how he truly believes in mask wearing, in hand washing, in social distancing, maintaining that 6-foot distance with people, when he regularly pokes fun at other people. Even like Joe Biden this past week, he said he wears a big mask at all times. These things have been detrimental to a good response from this administration, and I find it really difficult to see how they will dig themselves out of this in the coming weeks. And let me be very honest as well. This is a fast-moving story. I do not believe the president is in the White House because he has mild symptoms. I believe he's been taken to Walter Reed because his condition has escalated. Given his comorbidities, we should believe that.
Yeah, absolutely. They only take you to ICU or within walking distance of an ICU if you are properly sick. Sure. Let's discuss that point, Rina. Take it back to Rajib in New Delhi. Rajib, why is it so many politicians are kind of hiding behind this idea of, oh, I'm tested every day. Oh, I get the quick saliva test in the morning, then I get the nasal test in the evening. Why does that happen? Because testing is fine, but it only takes you so far.
No, to be fair, none of, or at least certainly the vast majority of the Indian politicians haven't taken this position, though there have been some odd statements coming from limited numbers. The challenge in India is actually ramping up the testing a lot more. The US and Russia, for example, in numbers of testing per million, they are testing about 6 times more than India. Brazil is about 1.5 times more. So while on one hand, India has indeed ramped up testing a lot, but it's still a lot of ground to cover to be able to reach those levels. And perhaps then we would get some reasonable idea or estimation of the infection rate in the community.
Heidi Larson in London. Will Mr. Trump's medical condition as of now, what happened to Boris Johnson, what happened to Jair Bolsonaro, what happened to Prince Charles as well in the UK, will that be enough to convince the pandemic skeptics that they've got it wrong?
Well, the pandemic skeptics have dug. I don't think will be easily swayed to think they got it wrong. I've worked a lot with some of the, we study a lot of these refusing groups, and they're quite set in their ways. I don't think they would feel like they got it wrong for some individuals. And we see that happening in the way that these resistance groups, the protests against lockdowns and masks and even vaccines, in the face of rising numbers. So unfortunately, we're going to have to work around those the people who are pandemic deniers, as it were. But there are a lot of other people that still need to be persuaded that this is real and this is a huge threat. And actually, we're going into a much potentially worse phase in the context of pending influenza epidemics.
Rina, in Washington, briefly, do you think there's a chance here there's only one thing that will make people behave properly wherever they are in the world, and that's if and or when they get it?
Yes, I do believe it is that. But look, this is, I do not mean to underplay at all the President of the United States contracting COVID-19. This really will raise the consciousness of many Americans who perhaps felt that they too are medically invincible, like the president has been acting. And perhaps they will also stop congregating in large groups. They will perhaps engage in safer practices, such as even wearing goggles or sunglasses, because we know eyes to be a vector as well. So there are so many things that people can do that science has actually taught us over the past many months. We know so much more about this virus now than we did just a few months ago. So I think a lot of Americans, with our top leader having contracted it, there may be a general sense that I don't want to fall into the same fate. And there are things that I can do. And let me just be a little bit more self-conscious and self-aware of my everyday actions. I do believe that will be the positive outcome here.
Coming back to you, Rajib, in New Delhi, do you get the feeling there that whether it's your Prime Minister, the UK Prime Minister, the Brazilian President or the US President, if they retrospectively have not chimed as one with the science, they kind of then hemorrhage political credibility?
Well, as the Lancet noted in its editorial in the last week of September, what it called the dangers of false optimism. And it called for a lot of far more data transparency than at present. And let me underscore the point that this editorial was specifically on the Indian situation. So therefore, certainly there is an element of false optimism, whether it's at the political level or whether it's on the ground. And I believe, just as the WHO said, test, 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 the mantra should also be communicate, 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 because that's really not getting the attention, particularly given the diversity of some of these large countries, diversities of language, of culture, of perception, particularly with a very strong social media presence, which can make or break belief systems and convictions. So communication is certainly been the weakest link of all, and that's going to be tested in the coming months.
Heidi Larson in London. The Pew Centre did some research. Granted, it was before Mr. Trump went public with his diagnosis, and they said 63% of card-carrying Republicans believe the whole thing is at least overblown. Even if politicians now, in the light of what's happened to the US president, even if politicians, wherever they are in the world, want to get stricter with the signals, with the health message, how do you get through to those people who still want to believe, oh, if I go jogging wearing a mask, it'll kill me. Oh, it's a conspiracy theory. Oh, it's a cunning plan by the Chinese.
I think that we really need to communicate better in the gaps in communication about what COVID is, because I think there is a perception that it's like the flu, and it is so not like the flu. This is a long, I mean, they're increasingly referring to it as long COVID. It has, as we heard from our Indian colleague, there's also an after a shock when your whole immune system can go into overdrive even after your initial symptoms. This is affecting different organs in the body. These are systemic issues, and somehow we need to get more personal stories out by people who have experienced this and can speak to how important it is. I think that's a crucial issue.
Have we now reached a time, Rina, where the federal government and the state government, I mean, I hear what you say about, you don't like government involvement per se in day-to-day life, but have we reached a point now where the federal government have got to give way and say primacy is the science? I mean, it is so bad now. Donald Trump inside a military hospital. Why not just make the head of the CDC and the head of the FDA joint vice presidents and make the president for 6 months Anthony Fauci and give him executive power? Because at least then people would be doing the right thing, yeah?
Well, that's probably never going to work in these United States. I'll tell you why, because we have a succession of power outlined in our governing documents. And that is all these people, cabinet heads, after you get vice president and the speaker of the House, you've got a lot of people who are in line to the presidency. So an unelected government bureaucrat is never going to be put in the top position, no matter what happens. And this would be the position that one would think that a pandemic really forces someone's hand to do something more. But I have been completely underwhelmed by my government's response, whether it's at the local, state, or federal level. I think people are very confused because when you see at the very top that there is no cohesive strategy, there's no plan of action for the many months ahead. Everything has been very hopscotch. And just 2 weeks ago, this very same president, who is now in the military hospital, was out on his campaign trail in Ohio at a rally packed with folks saying this virus, quote unquote, virtually impacts virtually no one except the elderly. He forgets he falls into the category of the elderly. So again, this is all from the top, but again, an unelected government bureaucrat is not going to be put in power. This would be a moment where I would hope that everybody in the line of succession would be quarantined right now. And I'll tell you at this very moment, we do not know that to be the case. So again, we have a very, very uncohesive strategy here in the United States. It's a very scary moment in time for us.
Which is a compelling way to wrap out our discussion. Heidi, Rajib and Rina, thank you all very much. They were our guests, Heidi Larson, Rajib Dasgupta and Rina Shah. Thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime via the website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also talk to us via Twitter @AJ Inside Story or tweet me. I'm @PeterDobbie1. From me, Peter Dobbie, and everyone on the team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. We will see you very soon. For the moment, bye-bye.